Hello and welcome to the Comic Rush. This is Script and Pencils, our comic book interview podcast where we talk to comic creators, writers, pencilers about their creations. This is now the fourth season of the show. Sorry, we had a very short third season. So this is season 4. So I wanted to kick off 2023 with new seasons. I hope you're sticking with us or coming back. It is a slow return to podcasting for us. We are kind of very gently coming back. I, as you know, am Paul. Sorry about that. Technical difficulties there. As you know, I'm Paul. I'm your host as always. Today for our first show, we're really lucky to be discussing a new book that's out in a few weeks. That isn't a comic as such, but talks a lot about a comic that's close to my heart and one of the comics I grew up with and still kind of following, which is 2000 AD and it's more especially Judge Dredd. But in a marked difference from Judge Dredd graphic novels and other books about Dredd, this book discusses modern British policing in relation to Judge Dredd and how Judge Dredd predicted our future. Does art influence life? Does life influence art? Yes, both those things are true, but the degree to which that intersects is an interesting minefield. And the man who's going to lead us through that is Michael Molcher, the author of the book.
Hello,
Mike. How are you?
As if by magic.
Yes. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm well, thank you, Paul. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. I'm really excited about this book because it's a very interesting subject matter that I feel has probably always been there, but may not have occurred to a lot of us to kind of approach, but certainly seem to have occurred to you.
Yeah.
I'm very curious at what point, in life really did these things start to kind of gel for you, these ideas that this is what Judge Dredd was doing, that rather than being a reaction, because I always feel that art is a mirror rather than a telescope. It's not supposed to show you where to go, although there are certain things to be learned from art, I think, but it shows you where you are right now at any given time. But you've kind of posited this idea that this is kind of predicted modern policing for us.
Yeah, I mean, I say in the book it's more kind of projection than necessarily straightforward predicting.
Yeah.
Despite the title of the book, but
sorry, yeah, I should have made that distinction.
Title of the book. But I think in terms of when it coalesced for me, I think it'd always been there in one form or another. But as with many white middle class British people, my contact with the police has been fairly minimal. They do not factor into my day-to-day existence. However, I many friends for whom that is unfortunately not the case. And I started writing the book because I'd written a whole series of short essays for the back matter of the Judge Dredd Mega Collection, which was a part works that was bought out by Hachette Part Works from, I think it was 2015. And there were a mix of just kind of critical analysis of some of the stories that were in those collections. But one or two of them kind of strayed much more into political territory and it kind of percolated away. And eventually I went, well, this is a book. And then I started researching, and I started work on the book 2 months after George Floyd died. So kind of the height of the BLM protests in 2020. And it's kind of impossible to consider something like Judge Dredd and the history of Judge Dredd and the individual stories and the themes that it plays with, in the context of what's happened over the last. I mean, it's not just something that's happened over the last 3 years. Go all the way back to Ferguson, 2014, and even further back to 1970s, 1980s. You can't talk about Judge Dredd shorn of its not only its context but also its politics. So as the more I read, and it's important to note, this isn't the book that I started out to write. This is the book that the reading I was doing just drew me towards, because the more I read across the spectrum of books about policing and politics over the last 45 years, the more the story beats of Judge Dredd just hit again and again and again and again. I thought, well, actually, these conclusions are inescapable for me now. So it absolutely it's a dicey prospect to claim again, accepting the title of the book, to claim that art necessarily predicts. But what Dredd managed to do by satirizing the present it was in, it showed us the path that we were on in a way that I don't think really much other art, if any other art, has really done. And in that respect, he is a unique character. He's a unique cultural expression of what I describe in the book as the sinews of the law and order agenda that sprang up, that really began to get their claws into British politics in the 1970s with the rise of the New Right and eventual the 1979 Thatcher victory in the general election, through to today, where concepts of securitization, of the idea that all government is now law and order politics in one form or another. The state has been hollowed out to the point where all that's really left, the only social force that's left, is the police. You look at this absolute police state of Megacity 1, where the judges are in charge of everything from welfare to warfare. And like I said, for me, the conclusions are inescapable.
And I think Judge Dredd's a fascinating character for that sort of stuff, because and this only occurred to me in the last sort of 10 years. It should have occurred to me sooner, but Judge Dredd is a character for whom you're asked to both root and condemn at the same time. It is one of the few strips, I think, that really gets away with having its cake and eating it, and especially with such regularity on a weekly basis, because he is an authoritarian character living in an authoritarian time, and yet some of the things he's kind of faced with are things where you do question your own kind of, like, actually, would I want a society like that? Would I want this type of? Is this what I want to see as a representation of humanity? But then equally, do you want authoritarianism?
Well, I mean, the thing about the strip is it's something of a Rorschach test that the people who do genuinely grapple with the ambiguity, that particularly John Wagner has always brought to the strip. They're relatively few and far between. I think people tend to decide one way or the other, and it's always fascinating to see what side people come down on. But ultimately, like you say, he is that contrast and that duality, that contradiction. And you have a character who is responsible for the death of billions. So you've got stories like the Apocalypse War, where spoilers for anyone who hasn't still read it, even if you know the ending, because it's absolutely brilliant. But there's nuclear war. Megacity 1 is invaded, and Dredd leads a kind of a suicide mission to wipe out the opposing megacity, East Meg 1. He slaughters billions at the touch of a button, without any remorse, without any compunction. and Garth Ennis talks a lot about how Dread is the hard bastard that you want to make hard decisions at the moment. You don't want one of these lily-livered, hand-wringing liberals worrying about things. You want, you want the cowboy to come in and deliver justice. But even when the strip does that, it then eventually turns it on its head. So 30 years later, you've got epics like the Day of Chaos, because John Wagner absolutely, almost destroying Mega City 1, and that was a consequence of the decision that Dredd made at the end of the Apocalypse War.
Right.
And there's this incredible, it's just Henry Flint, who's just this wonderful master of emotion and pathos. He draws Dredd almost completely in shadow, just kind of hunched, his head's down, he's hunched over, and it's just that, this is his fault. All these further millions upon millions of people dead because of a consequence of a clear-cut decision that he made. So the moral ambiguity within Dredd is what I think makes him a fascinating comic book character, and he's so easily overlooked as well. People possibly because their experience of Dredd is limited, or is the Stallone movie or something like that. They tend to think of him as a one-note character, but actually, as you said, he's just a brilliant comic book character, unique in comics, in that he carries with him at all times that ambiguity of hero and villain. In the book, I lean into my 17th century history with the
as we all do,
as you all do, yeah. With the description of Oliver Cromwell, that most English of tyrants, who was described by the royalist Earl of Clarendon as the brave bad man. And for me, that just beautifully sums up Dredd.
Yeah.
Absolutely, in a pinch, you want somebody who's going to make the hard decisions, but at the same time, look at this monster. Look at the system that he is part of and enables and participates in. So, and that's the genius of John Wagner. At the end of the day, one of the greatest comic book writers British comics has ever produced, and certainly I think one of the greatest writers that comics has produced, full stop.
Yeah, fantastic writing. I mean, I certainly remember reading these stories back then, even though I don't, despite the credit blocks on comics, I don't think I was ever really aware of comic creators for a long time, until I got a bit older, and I thought they just magically appeared. And
well, of course, it didn't help that certainly at the height of when John Wagner and Alan Grant were working together on the strip, the publisher, their managing editor, John Sanders, was concerned that everybody would see just how much 2000 AD was relying on these only two people. At one point they were writing like 4/5 of every issue. And so you've got all these pseudonyms, like TB Grover is one that they use together. Carlos Esquerra used to use them as well. What's my favorite one? John F. Kander, which I seem to recall, and I'm probably getting this wrong. It's like was the name of a local garage owner, and it was John effing Kander.
Brilliant.
And stuff like that. And they were incredibly prolific, and together, the stuff they produced, Judge Dredd, Strontium Dog, so many incredible moments that I think sometimes we forget just how great and prolific they were.
And also I think that the thing about their stories and 2000 AD in general, Judge Dredd especially, is that because of the longevity of the book itself, of the comic, of the stories, you can spend years away from it and then go back and still find things that you're enjoying and love and get excited by. I mean, I'm going through that process now because over the last couple of years, I'm making like a slow kind of return to 2000 AD, and of course, it thanks in part to Owen putting together the best 2000 AD Volume 1. It made me realise, God, I really miss this and want to go back. And I think, but with Dread, I mean, is it difficult as a reader, do you think, to know which side of the coin you fall on? Because it does feel like increasingly today, and I'm not going to be the old man ranting about kids today, but there is an element of pick a side. And I think with Dread, it is kind of difficult. What side of the argument do you possibly fall on?
Well, I mean, the creators themselves were fairly categorical.
Yeah.
Even John says he's a villain, but he's a villain that you love
to
have around. And there's, just because the strip deals with and plays with that ambiguity doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't aware of it. I mean, sometimes it's so obvious. I mean, particularly when stories where Alan Grant was in the driver's seat, it was very obvious what side of the divide he fell on, and over time they came to realize that they were being a bit too subtle, even when they weren't being subtle at all. They weren't being unsubtle enough. So you end up with things like the democracy storylines, where they go, you have to understand the judges are bad. Will you please understand this is not to be admired? But I think actually a comic book character that makes you question that is invaluable. The strip isn't necessarily didactic. What it does is it makes you question your assumptions.
Yeah,
any kind of teacher of rhetoric and philosophy will tell you that actually that's a better learning experience than necessarily picking a side and going, well, this is all I want to hear about. But I think I disagree that necessarily that's a modern thing, or something that the kids do. You've only got to look at the 1970s when Dread was created to see a very similar.
I was being flipped, by the way. I wasn't.
Oh yeah, no. But you raise an important point about it, because sometimes there can be a tendency to eschew nuance and ambiguity and want declarative statements, and that's absolutely fine. I think where you run into problems, particularly with things like superheroes, is that sometimes they can be so bland and apolitical that you end up just writing onto them whatever you wish. I mean, I'm making a sweeping statement there, but I think in contrast to Dread, the ambiguity, the nuance, the question is baked into the whole thing, and for me, as I describe in the book, that is where the strip reflects our relationship with the relationship and history of policing. That in a liberal society, you have what is in essence an illiberal power, one that can strip you of your freedom, and governments that wish to strip you of your rights, and all this, that, and the other. But I think by having characters like that, by having stories that play all the sides and mess around with the reader's perceptions, I think that's a far greater learning experience, and far more useful, particularly to a young audience, than anything else.
And of course, there is a thing where I guess the things you enjoy in art aren't necessarily the things you enjoy in life. I mean, I think you can enjoy. Maybe you enjoy a bit of authoritarianism in your comic, but you don't necessarily want that on your street every day. Yeah. Or
it's not something that I explored in a massive amount in the book, because that's another book in
Of
of
course.
itself. It's about the kind of moral economy, the moral landscape of British comics,
Mm.
and where Dredd gets this its morality from and its humor from. And I trace it back very particularly, and I know Alan Moore has brought this up before, that you look at creators like Ken Reed and Leo Baxendale, and their characters, their stories are full of startling morality, not in a Puritan way, but just in a mischievous, almost childlike way. That the high are brought low and the low are raised up, and when everybody, whenever anyone is oppressed, they get their own back, and whenever anyone overreaches themselves, they get their comeuppance. And there's a great deal of the humor in Dredd, and I think why Dredd appeals to so many of its readers is the wonderful mischievous glee of watching people who seem to deserve punishment getting punishment, and getting it without reservation or ambiguity. But then, of course, the strip asks questions about whether they do. What is it saying about you that you think they deserve to be punished? And the delightful thing about Dredd in our age now is that I would hope a lot more people are coming to understand that the catharsis of seeing people you don't like get punished has much wider ramifications and much darker ramifications than the immediacy of it. You see it in reactions to things like the Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion protests. Of course the police should be, why are they not going up there and smacking them around? And well, it's because they could do that to you as well.
Yeah.
And so what Dredd does is it plays with this incredible morality, this legacy of British comics and this dark humor, to hopefully make you think. Kind of.
I mean,
mostly.
Yeah, I mean, personally speaking, I've had a few encounters with the police. Some have been unpleasant, to say the least. Some have not. And there've been a fair few when they've, actually prevented some horrible things from happening to me or to people I go with. So, there is but it's getting increasingly difficult now to kind of support the police. Do you feel that way?
Yeah. I'm
choosing my words carefully.
Well, no, absolutely. And you're right to do so. I'm slightly less circumspect in the book because I think one of the ways in which law and order rhetoric has poisoned our discourse over the last 50 years is that it simplifies everything down to moral binaries of good and bad, which is always going to end up with someone getting hurt. But also what it does is it tries to blunt criticism of the institution by talking about individuals. How can you say this about this hardworking police officer? They go, well, they may well be hardworking. I don't know them. But the institution itself, the thing that they are a part of, has much wider social ramifications. And what we've seen over the last 50 years is that as the state has been hollowed out by neoliberal politics, which is effectively what it has been, the problems that the welfare state, schools, libraries, etc., either covered over or helped alleviate, have increasingly bubbled to the surface. And so the only power that's left in society is the police. And so the police are asked to deal with, and you hear them complain about this quite a lot, that they're not social workers. they're being asked to deal with mental health issues and poverty, and the consequences of those things on society. And so you end up in a situation where an institution whose really only real recourse is that force is being asked to deal with subtle, difficult, long-term problems in our society. And
sorry.
inevitably it doesn't work.
Yeah, and those are
the,
governmental problems that the government should actually. That's what your taxes are for, right?
Yeah. Well, but if you to get deep into the politics of it, Friedrich von Hayek, the father of neoliberalism, the Austrian economist, who of whom Thatcher was an acolyte, he specifically said there's only one area of the state that should exist, and that's law and order. There should be no other government, really, because the police should be there to make sure that the market operates regulated, without impediment. And it's just, I mean, it's a frightful philosophy that continues to cause us no end of problems, and is at the root of our so many of our current woes. And what I talk about in the book is how policing is so integral to neoliberal politics that what the state demands the police do has grown and grown and grown and grown, and it's got to the point where the police exist not to alleviate the pressure on the boiling pot, but to screw the lid down ever tighter. When we've got environmental activists engaging in non-violent protest being labeled terrorists,
it's worrying.
Yeah, and has such a parallel with stories like Revolution in Judge Dredd, where, of course, in the upside down world of Judge Dredd, the terrorists are pro-democracy. But you get this huge non-violent movement calling for democracy, and the judges undermine it because for them, the safety of the city is synonymous with the continued existence of the judges, and that's the point where we're getting to, where the state and policing are coterminous. Then they're not balanced parts of a liberal system that has all its checks and balances. They are the same thing, and that's really worrying when a government has decided it doesn't want us to go on strike, it doesn't want us to protest anymore, and you go, well, then what's left?
Yeah.
And
you may as well not vote at that point, right? I mean,
this is the thing. I've got a whole chapter on the destruction of democracy, and I'm not one of those tub-thumping maniacs who goes on and on about parliamentary boundaries or whatever. But it's more that the day-to-day existence of democracy in our lives has been diminished, so that just asking people to go to the polls every 4 years, or every year for council elections and things like that, or just doesn't seem to play a part in day-to-day existence. Whereas once upon a time, and there's a lot of reasons why this has gone away, democracy was a part of everyday life because it was part of your society, it was part of your community. You had a voice. Some people had a voice in their community. So the thing with Dredd, bringing it back to the comics, is that what Wagner and Grant saw in the rise of Thatcherism was this impulse to punish and to force. So you moved away from a society built on supposedly built on consent and cooperation to one that and there's a lot more history to it than this. I'm making massive generalizations. Was one based on enforcement. You will behave. You won't choose to behave. You will behave. And Dredd represents the end game for this kind of politics, where you view anyone as a criminal. There's a very famous bit early on in Judge Dredd when he returns from he had a sojourn, about a 6-month sojourn to the moon. And he comes back and he says, 800 million citizens, every single one a potential criminal. By God, I love it. And you have a city where it's not just that everyone's a potential criminal; they are all perps in one way, shape, or form. The law has made it impossible for them to be lawful.
Yeah.
You get the wonderful story a bit later on in the lead up to the Apocalypse War, where the judges do a crime swoop, a crime blitz, where they basically bash down someone's door, tear the apartment apart, looking for any contraband or any illegal activity and whatnot. And this guy is completely squeaky clean. Absolutely, he cooperates. Nothing in his apartment they can get him on. And Dredd just goes, I don't like it. He's too clean. No one's that clean. It's suspicious. So imagine living in a society where the state says, if you do keep your nose clean, then you are suspicious. It's that topsy-turvy logic to the whole thing, which is hilarious, fascinating, and terrifying all at the same time.
And do you feel that, like, not just Judge Dredd, but let's broaden it and say entertainment art in general, does it have to share some responsibility for the way we live now? Because I feel like when you look at things like Dredd and just the absurdities contained therein, and I'm talking about the absurdities of the society, of the people now, rather than the judges. Not they're not people, but I feel like today we're kind of almost, we're shown absurdities, and it's almost rather like, oh God, no, let's not go there. It's almost like challenge accepted, And, I mean, do you feel that some of the authoritarianism that's in society today is a kind of overreaching, overacting response to just how absurd we've become as people? Because I look around today, and on one side, I'm very kind of, I like, what the police do, and especially when you look at the US and the horrors that are being inflicted on people of color there, and I just, it's like, this is absurd, and this is really wrong on a moral level, on any kind of structured level. This is just disgusting. But then at the same time, I look around at people, not people of color or stuff like that, but just people in general today in society, and I just think we've all gone mad. Like, we have become insane as a society, and I include myself. You know what I mean? Like, it's like I'm here too. And I just wonder, does art, just as a thinking process, does art share a responsibility for that? Have we kind of
long answer short, no.
Right.
Because art can only speak to us. It could not control us. Really interesting point. So one of the things that the is always evident in Dredd, and one of the things that people bring up the most is the craziness of the citizens. How mad they are. Whether it's the footsies, the future shocked individuals who just can't cope with the pace of modern life and they just go crazy, start, killing people. Or you've got the fatties, the hyper obese people going around with little belly wheels and all this, that, and the other. And so in reaction to that, the judges look rational and necessary. Now, I was only recently I've only recently had this brought to my attention, and it pained me to read this because it would have been perfect to include in the book. But I spend a not an insignificant amount of one of the chapters basically saying the same point, which is Quentin Tarantino. Whatever you think of his films, you know, at the end of the day,
sure.
he's a film nerd. And he in his recent book, he analyzes Dirty Harry, which of course was one of the progenitors of Judge Dredd back in the 70s. And he talks about how the political climate of the 1970s was a reaction to change, social change, economic change, moral change. But what he very specifically says, and I wanted to reflect that in the book as well, is that the change is not the problem. It's how people are reacting to it. And Tarantino very nicely, which is why I just absolutely kicking myself that the quote wasn't around when I was writing the book. He describes it as future shock. Now, anybody who knows their 2000 AD knows that future shocks, a very long-standing story tradition within 2000 AD. Footsie's, you know, future shocked individuals, going all borrowed from the work of Alvin Toffler, who was a futurist in the 1960s and 70s. He described future shock as the disorientation caused by the overwhelming pace of change. Now, he was talking about technological change, the idea that in the future technology will just be, and we've all been bewildered by an iPad, let's face it. But actually, the key driver of the future shock that Tarantino was talking about, that Dirty Harry was plugging into, was this social change. And the thing about social change is that, from my perspective, it's driven by people asking for equality and asking for freedom. And particularly in America, you know, Dirty Harry is very much a reaction against because of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. He was plugging into people like politicians like George Wallace, Richard Nixon, who kind of coined law and order as a political agenda after the 1968 disturbances and the murder of Martin Luther King. Ronald Reagan, of course, who was Californian governor before he was president. He was responsible for the absolutely brutal reprisals against the protesters in Berkeley, the University of California. So it's I don't think we're losing our minds. It's just that things are changing. We're in a state of flux. And what that is producing amongst those who would like the things to stay the same is a reaction. And I talk about the moral panic that grew up in the 1970s around crime and youth and mugging, race. These all kind of came together, and there's a wonderful line from Andy Beckett. Andy's a Guardian columnist, but he wrote a book called When the Lights Went Out, which is a true history of what actually happened in the 1970s. And he talks about how within culture, in the 70s, there seemed to be this fascination with something fiercer. So you get your Dirty Harry, you get the Sweeney. You know, Dixon of Dock Green is out. You've got the second chapter of my book just begins with the line, in the 1970s, all cops were bastards. You know, and that's riffing off that reaction. It's not that necessarily the culture is driving that. It's a part of it. Don't get me wrong. And these things can become, you know, self-fulfilling prophecies. But ultimately, there was a lot of reaction to what was a process of social change, and you're seeing that now. It's the mugging crisis of the 1970s is no different to the crime crisis that our government and the American government routinely stoke to make us feel unsafe. And when people feel unsafe, they'll throw anyone else under the bus.
Yeah,
and that's where we're at.
Okay.
So yeah.
I mean, in terms of the kind of authoritarianism of the police and some of the ridiculous, the horrible things that police do, and again, by that we can safely assume we're not talking about every single member of the police. And
you always have to say that.
Yeah, well, because I do feel you do, because again, it's I find it difficult to, apart from the Tory party, I find it difficult to damn an entire organisation. However, the things that the police are getting away with is no doubt a symptom of that organisation, as you point out.
Yeah.
I always think when one of these horrible incidents happens, there is part of me inside that goes, I hope this is going to be the one that at least changes things and makes things, and it doesn't. It never does. It's like, I guess it's like people looking at school shootings and going, oh, I hope this is the one that makes them change their gun laws in the US. And it's just like, no, everything just doubles down. Do you see a light at the end of the tunnel in terms of this authoritarianism and these acts of brutality?
Funnily enough, I did an interview yesterday and they asked me exactly the same question.
Right.
And
I'm not very original, I have to admit.
No. It's not that, but it's the natural kind of, like, there is a huge problem. Is there any solution? Is there any way out of this situation? And the thing about writing about Dredd is that in his society, it's too late.
Yeah.
There's characters who have hope. They deal with it in different ways. You get characters like Chopper, who's the sky surfing, wall scrolling teenager.
One of my absolute favorites.
Well, exactly. And it was something, I think it was Richard, former editor of 2000 AD, Richard Burton, said when I think he was on the train into London to go to work one day, and he saw Chopper's wall scroll on reproduced on a wall, and he went, that kind of struck him, actually, the connection between culture and real life. But Chopper, as discussed in the book, very nearly broke his story up into 2 entire chapters because he's such a fascinating character. But he deals with the oppression of the judges on a personal level. Only he, he's not a leader. He's just an individual, indeed, as the city makes him. So his rebellion is all about first of all, making his name, and then B, flying away, escaping it. But then you go, well, what about everybody else? Not everybody else can do that. And you do get one very recent character called Noam Chomsky, which is a wonderful character created by Ken Nyman and PJ Holden. And he's one of the intelligent apes that exist in Megacity. He's genetically engineered intelligent apes. And that's a very interesting take on the whole Chopper thing, in that Noam is much more about trying to protect his community. He's much more of your local neighborhood Spider-Man, and then he's always trying to get one over on the judges, but he's doing it to protect the people that he cares about and the community that he cares about. And so that's a different kind of hope. And ultimately, I think with Dredd, what Wagner and especially Wagner, but also to a lesser extent Alan Grant did, was they placed the pursuit, the glimmer of hope within Dredd himself, in that questions about the system play out in his mind, because he's the exemplar of the system. In many ways, he holds the system together. Without Dredd, the judges would there wouldn't be that shining knight on the hill over there who people go, actually, he's great, so whatever. And so multiple times he's had these doubts, and then he's always come back stronger, and then he has doubts again, because the thing about oppression is it is brittle. I think I just quoted Andor, actually, just You know, a show absolutely about about how you resist, and you resist through sacrifice, you resist through resisting, and you do it however you can. You do it with all the tools at your disposal. You certainly don't play the game by their rules. In Dread's world, there is hope, but there has to be sacrifice. Because there's a quote by Nye Bevan where he described fascism as the future refusing to be born, and Dread's world is very much, you know, they can debate until the bloody cows come home about whether Judge Dredd is a fascist or not. At the end of the day, he bloody well is. But Megacity 1 is society preserved in aspic, held on the precipice. I'm coming out with all the metaphors today. You know, held from collapsing, but with this terrible tight grip that's so brittle and hurts so many people. And it's a world where the future just refuses to be born because the judges won't let it be born because their world is one of control. So narratives of resistance inevitably involve the fragility of their rule. And I always appreciate a story in Judge Dredd where the judges are shown to be rubbish. Because they are. Because why is there still so much crime? You control every aspect of this society. You know, discounting. I mean, even so, when the Dredd series started in 1977, the in-universe year was 122 years in the future, and it was 2099. That the most futuristic date, aside from 2000 AD. You know, all these comics keep using. There's something wonderfully millenarian about it. But anyway, and that's kind of the apex of Dredd society. That's when it's its biggest, when the judges are at the height of their powers. And then it's been decline ever since, crisis after crisis after crisis after crisis, to the point where you've got a city that, you know, on Carlos Escala's Future Graph, on the back of issue 3 in 1977 said, you know, 100 million citizens, which isn't actually that many, but to the end of the day of chaos, where you're talking about 50 million citizens, which is, you know, whatever, roughly the population of Greater New York. And it's like, have the judges kept them safe? No. And that for me that's the burning satire at the heart of Judge Dredd, is even with all these resources, even with this great man, this brave bad man at the helm, you're more likely to be slaughtered in your own home than you are to be saved by him, you know? In fact, there's a fantastic story by Al Ewing, and I think the art was Ben Oliver. It was a few years ago now, and it was called Cockroaches. And I'm absolutely going to spoil it for anybody listening. But it was this guy, a member of the city def, so the city defense militia, which each city block has in Mega City 1. Because, of course, the city is absolutely crawling with guns. And he survived every crisis. He survived the reign of Mad Judge Cal. He survived the Apocalypse War. He survived Necropolis when the Dark Judges tried to take over the city. You know, he survived Judge Grice's meat virus. You know, all these manifold crises. And he gets this medal from Dredd, or the chief judge, whoever it is. And the story reveals him to be a serial killer. because he's a wonderfully different approach to footsie, to Future Shock. So it's not that he's going into a plaza and spraying bullets around. He's just picking people off, because from his point of view, really the only survivors of that kind of society are the cockroaches.
Yeah.
You know, the people who are going to at the very bottom are just going to, you know, the predators and whatnot. And it's just it's so clever. It's so startling when the strip turns on a penny and just slaps you in the face. And Wagner and Grant were brilliant at that. And so were writers like, you know, Al Ewing, Rob Williams, you know, the people who really understand the moral economy and the moral landscape of this strip. And so it's one of those series which it's the reason why I wrote the book. It needed to be said what this strip actually is and what it's done and what it's said, because it's all too easy to dismiss it as something two-dimensional, as something that was from the Thatcherite past, or is somehow for kids, or, you know, for people who think the judges are good. It's so much more than that. And the more I researched, the more I read, the more I looked at it, the more I realized just how clever, at times contradictory, at times not as subtle as it should be, but you know, just how fantastic this strip has been over the last 45 years at plucking at those sinews of law and order and going, you don't want this. You don't want this. You're laughing, but you don't want this.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know?
Absolutely. I've got one question for you there. I'm not sure you're going to be able to answer, given your position working at Rebellion, or perhaps you don't want to answer.
Sure.
But I'm going to ask it anyway. Would
I
you
mean,
like to?
About 5 separate questions, and they always get asked. But you
Okay.
say what it is. Yeah.
Would you like to see a direction for Judge Dredd where the judges do effectively become obsolete and get disbanded, and the society in Mega City does change? What does that look like, and is that something you'd like to see?
Well, so I can only speak to what both John Wagner and Garth Ennis have said, and Rob Williams as well. Actually, he said something along these lines. All people who've written their fair share of Dredd, and they've all said in one form or another that bringing democracy back, or you know, changing Mega City 1 would mean that Dredd wouldn't work, because he needs to be part of that system. He needs to be, you know, it's exemplar, it's shining light. I disagree. I think actually there's lots of stories to be told where Dredd is compromised, and I think actually a lot of the emotional story beats over the last sort of 20 years, perhaps, are where Dredd has found himself on the out. Whether it was after Day of Chaos, where he gets effectively exiled to the Cursed Earth by the new Chief Judge. After Origins, it's Mutants in Mega City 1 and Tour of Duty collections. Through to stories like Titan and Enceladus by Rob Williams and Henry Flint, where Dredd is being pushed to the absolute edge, and you know, deep questions are being asked about his place within the judges and whether he's right. The Small House, again by Rob and Henry, where Dredd effectively has to work against the best interests, what would appear to be the best interests of the judges. So I think there's still a hell of a lot of life in the old dog yet. It's just that I think sometimes, and this isn't a criticism, this is just an observation. Sometimes I think creators can be a little reluctant to break it too much in case it all breaks. But you know, John Wagner destroyed all but 50 million of the population, and Dredd continued. So who's to say what punishment the guy can take? There's plenty of ways you could do it. I think Dredd's at his most interesting when it's either there's a fantastic series of stories called The Graveyard Shift, drawn by Ron Smith back in the day, of just like one night on the streets and all the craziness he has to deal with, and those are fantastic stories. And then you get the slightly more dynastic struggle ones, where the very meaning of the system is being questioned. So I think any character where you can do so many different types of story, you can make him a cowboy, you can make him a war hero, you make him a social worker.
I mean, look, you're talking to someone whose favorite Dread story is Night of the Werewolf, and
Steve Dillon,
Steve
Dillon, yeah,
which is nothing really to do with the kind of.
Well, but it's just a perfect example of how adaptable a character it is. You do gothic horror with The Dark Judges. You do schlocky horror with Cry of the Werewolf.
Cry of the Werewolf, yes, thank you.
Yeah, you've got The Haunting of Sector House 9 with Brett Ewing's artwork, one of my personal favorites. You've got Judge Anderson, of course, his psychic colleague. So she has her spin-off and does all kind of the ghost stories and the psychic stories and all this, that, and the other. And then at one point he Dredd jails Satan himself, and then a huge alien calling itself Satan rocks up at the west wall by the cursed earth, and they have to defeat him. And I just 45 years, and I actually, by and large, I think it's not that writers have only just scratched the surface. I think there's just so much more potential there to do lots of really interesting things. I tell you what, I would love. I'd love more Elseworlds style stuff. So year before last, we bought out the Megatropolis collection, which is by Ken Nymond and Dave Taylor, which is beautiful Art Deco style. It was basically Judge Dredd, but in the style of as Fritz Lang's.
See, I haven't brought that yet, and I keep going to it. Gosh, I keep going to looking at it.
Great, it's really fantastic. What's fantastic about it is that if you know your Dredd. Yeah, there's all the Easter eggs. They've all got the same names. There's interesting parallels with the relationships between them. But if you've not read any of that, actually, it's just a really great kind of futurist noir Art Deco thriller, which I really, really enjoy. So I'd love to see more stuff like that, because sometimes I think Dredd's continuity progresses like ours does. So, 1 year in our time is 1 year in his time. And as useful as that can be sometimes, I think sometimes it can hamstring interesting stories. So sure. I'm all for, we do a lot of kind of year 1, year 2 style stories, but I'm all for kind of Elseworlds, just, one of my favorite Batman stories is Mignola's Gotham by Gaslight.
Yeah, absolutely stunning. Yeah,
that playing around with themes and ideas and iconography of Dredd. I think that would be my way forward, certainly.
Okay. Well, it's an excellent book. It's a very challenging book, a very challenging read. And it's certainly a very educational book. I feel in reading it, there are things in there I've learned, and in fact, from this conversation, I feel there's so much I've learned and sort of challenging my perceptions of things. So I really appreciate you doing that and taking the time to do it.
My pleasure.
Obviously, what does shine through most of all is your love for the character and the stuff that Rebellion are putting out. And thank you for sharing that with us.
Absolutely. I've been reading Dredd since I was 10 years old, and he's been a constant in my life since then. So if any, I've said before, this book is my love letter to my favorite character, and the genius of John Wagner, Carl Siscala, Alan Grant, Pat Mills, Mick McMahon, Brian Bolland, and all the creators working on it today is just, I think, cruelly overlooked as a great
absolutely. And the good thing is, every few years there's a sort of sudden awareness of their work that comes in, but it does fade, as with all comic creators. I think there is a kind of rise and fall of awareness, and I really appreciate you making this book, which helps keep that stuff alive and keep that awareness going. The book is out 23rd of
February. Yeah,
23rd of February. It's a great book. Got one there that Mike very kindly sent us. Can we just quickly mention Best of 2000 AD Volume 2, which is out tomorrow?
Yeah.
Hopefully a review coming very, very soon on the Comic Crush. I do want to say thank you to everyone who took a look at the advanced review for Volume 1 last year.
Yeah,
because that was like record numbers for the website, and I really appreciate you. Like it was I got one of my first sort of traffic spike warnings on that. A lot of people looking at the website today.
Well, I mean, we all know it's a fine line between popularity and denial of service attacks.
Let's just hope. Let's just hope it's just popularity. And thank you. To yourself and Owen and Rebellion for helping making that happen, because that was great. I hope even more of you turn out for the review for Volume 2, because Volume 2 is a ride. Like, I just absolutely loved it. And of course, what I don't have right next to me, unfortunately, because it's in a pile of stuff over there, is the Halo Jones omnibus hardcover. Have you got one there?
So that's the
fantastic.
That's the hardcover, and the slipcase.
Yeah. Yes, there is a slipcase, and this is available only on the website. Am I right?
Yeah, the slipcase is only from the 2000 AD website, but it is. Just
that's lovely. Yeah.
Gemma, one of our designers, Gemma Sheldrake, just threw her absolute heart and soul into this one, and it's come out really beautifully. So
she always does. I've seen some of Gemma's stuff before. She does a great job.
Job
on this stuff.
So she did. I think I'm correct. She did the web shop version of Alex de Campi and Eduardo. I'm sorry, I've forgotten his surname.
Barreto?
Say again?
Eduardo Barreto?
No. Oh, that's going to haunt me now. Anyway, Alex and Eduardo's Full Tilt Boogie.
Right, yeah, okay.
Which she did a fantastic kind of like a blueprint image of the ship from Full Tilt Boogie, which was
fantastic.
But yeah, there's in all praise to our designers. They've been putting out some beautiful books recently, which is nice.
They are gorgeous looking books. And what I'm actually very interested in is just because it sort of piqued my. I do a month recommendation for my patrons. One of the tiers is, hey, here's a bunch of comics that are coming out in the next few months that I think you should be getting. And for the first time, we put a trade on there, because we try and keep it to single comics and first issues and things like that. But we put a Very British Affair on there because some of the art in that looks gorgeous. And also,
so
look at that.
This is the web shop slipcase, which I can't work out where the camera is for some reason. It's right in front of me.
I have the same problem whenever I take selfies, which is why I don't take them.
So that, you get the slipcase, and then you get kind of printed. So a really interesting thing. I was talking to David Ayer at Thought Bubble, because we had a sampler of Very British Affair, and he commented that when he was designing his style for Hawkeye, he actually used this wonderful kind of blocky primary color style as inspiration.
And you can definitely see that. You can definitely see
absolutely.
that.
But yeah, I mean, Olivia Hicks, who's been the editor on this, David Roach, who's compiled it, written the introduction. It's just I'm just sat here reading it while everyone else is. A Very British Affair. I mean that's out. That's actually out this week. Because of international shipping, the release date has kind of zipped around a little bit as we've desperately awaited a boat from China.
Yeah. But there's, always. I mean, I especially love the Treasury of British comic stuff. And there's been some great things there. May's World was one of my favourites from the last few years that got reissued, and that gave me an opportunity to meet Arthur Ranson and things. Yeah. So, some amazing stuff that Rebellion are putting out, as well as 2000 AD every week. The magazine I can never pinpoint. Is the magazine weekly or monthly?
It's monthly. Yeah. It comes out on the third Wednesday of the month.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's some great stuff. In fact, I've found myself looking through back issue bins for old Judge Dredd magazines. And one of the reasons, not just because of the strips, but because of the great interviews that used to be in there with various comic creators and things. And
yeah, they were great, weren't they? Oh, I wonder who wrote those. Some of them.
Was it anyone we know? But they were fantastic. But I love those, and as we talked about, there's always stuff to go back to with 2000 AD.
Yeah. I mean, talking about the magazine, the printers comps have just come through.
Oh, lovely!
Devlin War collection, which is out in March, and that I mean, I'd love the John Smith series that he did, but Alish Cott, who's been writing Devlin War, just great stuff, really great stuff, and Mike Downing artwork as well. It's just stunning.
That's great. That's fantastic. Mike, thank you so much. You've given us so much of your time. We've gone way over whatever we've optimistically said would be the limit at the beginning.
Unfortunately, as anybody who's ever held a conversation with me knows, it will never run to time.
So although now we must call time, sadly. Thanks for everyone tuning in. Thank you so much, Mike. Thanks to everyone at Rebellion. Remember, we've got the Patreon. Please support. There is now a discount in the web shop for all Patreon patrons. So take advantage of that. You get some money off the comics that I sell on the website. Do follow us on Twitter, Instagram, find us on Facebook, all those places. It's been great to talk to you, Mike. Thank you. And goodbye, everyone.
Bye.